So we finished class last week talking about the riots and the Kerner Commission and how, you know, African Americans wake up after the Voting Rights Act. And while you have these things in place for systemic change, day-to-day life has not changed. And that's going to be an issue, right? Because you know, people tend to not have a whole lot of patience, right? And so part of this, of course, is that not only have you had these civil rights changes, but by 1965, 66, 67, LBJ has put forth all of his Great Society programs, and these things are coming in. So understand that if you are a privileged white American, you are looking at these circumstances and you are feeling like, well, wait a minute, we've got Great Society programs. We're paying using all this taxpayer money for this, and we've done voting rights and civil rights. Why are people still mad and frustrated? And you have the essential kind of disconnect between the world that African Americans have been living in under Jim Crow and, you know, the fact that these changes are going to take time to play out. And part of this, part of what comes to the forefront is not just the violence with the Watts riots. It's going to be issues with Black Power, Black nationalism, and the Black Panthers. So I'm going to kind of talk about what those are. I've got a few video clips that I'm going to intersperse here. First off, you've got the frustration with the economic inequality. So you start to have, and we've talked already about how the civil rights movement is not monolithic, right? It wasn't just the SCLC. It was also SNCC. It was also CORE. It was the NAACP. And then you have individuals who are acting individually. I mean, you've got people like James Meredith and Medgar Evers, and these guys are taking, they're acting, right? They're acting individually, and people are doing sit-ins, and you've got Woolworths, and you've got Freedom Summer in 1964, where you've got all these groups coming to register Black voters, and they're dealing with all of this pushback, right, from either, you know, people that want the status quo, or whether it's, you know, people that are like, well, what else can we do? And so it's into this that you're going to have even more fracturing within the African American community. And this is where Black Power comes from. And of course, part of this is frustration, particularly up north and out west, where perhaps the segregation was less was more about police brutality and police enforcement and policing and lack of economic opportunity, and less about you can't use this water fountain, or, you know, boy, get off the street or get off the sidewalk, you know. So I think you have to understand that there's a difference in the way you know, the segregation and this issue of power gets distributed depending on what region of the country you're in. And so you're going to start to have Black Power, this idea that African Americans are the ones that need to speak about this, that if they continue to allow voices that are not their own, that have not lived that life, then people don't understand what it is they're dealing with. So CORE and SNCC will expel their white members, right? And you'll start to have a rejection of Martin Luther King's kind of unity coalition approach. And, you know, Martin Luther King faces some pushback. Up north. I think it's HBO that has a really good documentary about the final years of MLK's life, and it's really quite fascinating. So if you have HBO Go, I encourage you to find that. So you have, you know, that happening. And Black Power takes on a lot of different meanings, right? Black Power can include the Black Panthers, but it doesn't have to. Black Power can include, you know, being proud of who you are, racial distinctiveness, right? This is where the Afros come in, and the dashikis, and, you know, changing names, and African studies. And so you begin to have, you know, this kind of pride in culture. You also begin to have people talking about social, political, and economic control. Stokely Carmichael, for example, this idea that Black communities need to control their community, that they need to advocate for their own economic power. They need to advocate for their own policing. They need, you know, and that it's okay to have self-defense, that sure, nonviolent direct action is great when you're in, you know, Birmingham, Alabama, but when you're in Oakland, California, and you don't have, you know, the systems in place the way they do in Birmingham, nonviolent direct action is not, because you're not going against this monolithic system, right? You're talking about individual police officers, and one might be perfectly fine and the other one's a horrible racist that beats people up. And so it's hard to kind of mobilize direct action against these kind of more fractured pieces of the white power structure, so to speak. And so some of these groups, these Black Power groups, will embrace the idea of self-defense, even to the point of threatening violence. And so the video I'm going to show you here is a clip, a trailer, that I think you'll find kind of interesting, but it does a really good job of encapsulating what Black Power is all about.
When someone asks me about violence, I just find it incredible, because what it means is that the person who's asking that question has absolutely no idea what Black people have gone through, what Black people have experienced in this country.
That's Angela Davis, by the way. Very interesting person.
In the 1960s and 70s, Swedish filmmakers arrived in America to explore the Black Power movement, which the U.S. media saw as a violent threat.
We're making the revolution by educating the people to the fact that they should arm themselves for self-defense.
Any racist dog policemen attack us, we will defend ourselves because we are bent on surviving.
30 years later, in the cellar of a Swedish television station, an amazing collection of unseen interviews was discovered with some of the greatest revolutionary minds in modern history.
There wouldn't be an American who wasn't for Black people. We hold America to our bosom.
When you get tired enough, it's when you want to sacrifice everything.
Get ridiculed and discriminated and be less than a man.
It's a question of dignity and decency.
My husband didn't make enough money because he was Negro.
We were moved and motivated and charged up by people who had already made a commitment to bring about change.
Dr. King is a great man and he's very patient. Unfortunately, I am from a younger generation. I am not as patient nor am I as merciful.
Black is beautiful, but Black isn't power. Knowledge is power.
In this bankrupt country, there is a point where caution ends and cowardice begins.
The community was flooded with drugs. Hoover and the FBI, they made sure that the drugs were an influence.
Anybody can die nobly for a cause. The sign of maturity is to live day by day for that cause.
We have to document our history. If we're going to tell the story, let's tell the story right.
The Black Power Mixtape, 1967 to 1975, featuring Erykah Badu, Harry Belafonte, Stokely Carmichael, Eldridge Cleaver, Kathleen Cleaver, Angela Davis, Talib Kweli, Huey P. Newton, Bobby Seale, and Amir Questlove Thompson.
So that does a pretty good job of explaining what Black Power is. And, you know, and again, it is perceived largely by white society as violent, as scary, right? But I think it's interesting if you really kind of break down some of what they were talking about. Yes, they talk about revolution, but they're not talking about overturning the American government. They're talking about create a revolution of creating fairness and equality regardless of race. But I'm not sure that American society circa, 1970 was ready to hear that. And so Black Power, has its own kind of militancy, sense of standing up for oneself, and how people perceived that would depend a whole lot on, how much privilege you had, to be real honest. The next person I wanted to point out is Malcolm X in the Nation of Islam. I've already touched on him when we talked about the letter from a Birmingham jail. So I'm going to show you a couple of videos about Malcolm X. This will pretty much tell you everything that's in this slide. Again, kind of is the voice of this Black nationalism, this Black kind of empowerment, before you get to Black Power, before you get to Black Panthers. So Malcolm X is very much part of that shaping. I think it is important to note that not only is he kind of groundbreaking in the Black Power movement, but he certainly kind of harkens back to that Marcus Garvey, Back to Africa, United Negro Improvement Association. There's a direct correlation there. And then the other part of it, too, is when he travels to Mecca, he softens his approach. In other words, prior to his trip to Mecca, in what is 63, 64, something like that, or maybe it's 62. It's somewhere right when the Birmingham campaign and those things are happening. Before he travels to Mecca, he's very hardcore, right? And very, we can't trust white society, all this kind of stuff. When he comes back and he kind of breaks with the Nation of Islam over what is essentially a kind of a sense that Elijah Muhammad was not fulfilling his role as a leader for the Nation of Islam, that he had some corruption and some sexual harassment, honestly, or what we would call sexual harassment today. I don't know that they would have then. And so what's going to happen is that Malcolm X will break away and start his own organization and begin to talk more about working with diverse groups, people of multiple races, people of multiple religions. So he doesn't exactly become like Martin Luther King, but he certainly changes his approach to one of more collaboration. I don't think he changes the militancy of trying to push for equality and change, but I do think he changes his attitude about being able to work with others. And then, of course, he's assassinated in 1965 by the Nation of Islam, who see him as a threat to the Nation of Islam and Elijah Muhammad's power, which is really unfortunate. And so these videos will really kind of break down for you who he is. The first one's kind of just a bio of him. The second one will go into him actually speaking, and I think you'll find that particularly interesting.
Malcolm X is an extraordinary figure for whom African Americans have this deep affinity.
Malcolm X is one of the most historic and most significant human beings in American history.
Malcolm Little was born May 19, 1925 in Omaha, Nebraska. His father, Earl Little, was an outspoken Baptist minister and supporter of Marcus Garvey's Back to Africa movement. His push for civil rights made him the target of death threats, forcing the family to move several times. In 1929, their home in Michigan was burned to the ground, and 2 years later, Earl was found dead. This was a devastating blow for Malcolm's mother, who was eventually committed to a mental institution. Her 8 children were sent to orphanages and foster homes. In school, Malcolm was a smart and focused student until he told his teacher in high school he wanted to become a lawyer.
He wanted to be a lawyer, but they told him that they said niggers don't get to be lawyers. So that's an unreasonable goal for a nigger. And so to some extent, America created Malcolm X. So those are the forces that made him into the person that he eventually became.
He dropped out and moved to Boston. Over the next few years, he held various jobs and moved from Boston to Flint, Michigan, to Harlem and New York, and finally back to Boston. During this period, he started his street career as a pimp, drug dealer, and gambler. In 1946, he was arrested for burglary and sent to prison. In prison, he began reading everything he could get a hold of. Inspired by his brother Reginald's conversion to Islam, Malcolm read the teachings of Elijah Muhammad and the Nation of Islam. Malcolm dropped his slave name Little and chose X to represent his lost tribal name. By the time he was paroled in 1952, he had committed himself to the Nation of Islam. He was a very charismatic and powerful speaker who conveyed Elijah Muhammad's teaching to the masses. He was appointed national spokesman. During this time, membership increased from 500 to 30,000.
Malcolm emerged as this extraordinarily talented, itinerant minister. And he preached a creed of Black superiority, that Blacks controlled themselves.
In 1958, Malcolm X married Betty X in Lansing, Michigan. The couple had 6 daughters, including twins Malak and Malika, born in 1965 after their father's death and named for him. Malcolm X rejected the civil rights movement's use of nonviolent protest. Instead, he encouraged Black men to use any means necessary to protect themselves.
But Malcolm's clarion call for Blacks to mobilize and fight against racism inspired millions of African Americans, even those who disagreed with him. They respected him as a person, as a man.
Malcolm's faith was challenged when he found out that the Honorable Elijah Muhammad had seduced several women in the Nation of Islam, and some had bore his children. In 1964, Malcolm X renounced Elijah Muhammad and left the Nation of Islam. He founded a religious organization, the Muslim Mosque Incorporated, and took a pilgrimage to the Holy Land of Mecca, Saudi Arabia. In Mecca, he met people of all races he could call his brothers. He renamed himself El Hajj Malik al-Shabazz and returned to the U.S. with new hope for the future. He founded the Organization of Afro-American Unity to unite blacks all over the world. Malcolm was seen as a threat to the Nation of Islam, and he was informed that members were plotting to assassinate him. His home was firebombed, but he and his family were unharmed. On February 21, 1965, Malcolm started a presentation at the Audubon Ballroom in New York when 3 gunmen ran up and shot him 15 times at close range. He was pronounced dead on arrival at the hospital. In his 39 years, Malcolm was constantly reinventing himself. At the end of his life, he was speaking to all races, not about civil rights, but human rights.
Malcolm's image of an uncompromising rebel who challenged and fought against racial injustice, and he was prepared to die for his beliefs.
He is a person that inspired millions of African Americans to figure out their self-worth, to elevate their self-esteem. He led people to command and demand more from the great country in which they live.
So that, all I can say is, America is a place for radicals. So this one we'll actually have him talking and kind of gives you a context, kind of gives you an idea for what his views were, especially prior to starting his own organization. And I think you'll find this particularly interesting.
In order for you and me to devise some kind of method or strategy to offset some of the events or a repetition of the events that have taken place here in Los Angeles recently, we have to go to the root. We have to go to the cause. Dealing with the condition itself is not enough. And it is because of our effort toward getting straight to the root that people oftentimes think we're dealing in hate. We are oppressed. We are exploited. We are downtrodden. We are denied not only civil rights, but even human rights. So the only way we're going to get some of this oppression and exploitation away from us or aside from us is come together against the common enemy. Who taught you to hate the texture of your hair? Who taught you to hate the color of your skin to such extent that you bleach to get like the white man? Who taught you to hate the shape of your nose and the shape of your lips? Who taught you to hate yourself from the top of your head to the soles of your feet? Who taught you to hate your own kind? Who taught you to hate the race that you belong to? So much so that you don't want to be around each other. No, before you come asking Mr. Muhammad, does he teach hate? You should ask yourself, who taught you to hate being what God gave you? And I, for one, as a Muslim, believe that the white man is intelligent enough. If he were made to realize how black people really feel and how fed up we are without that old compromise and sweet talk. Stop sweet talking him. Tell him how you feel. Tell him what kind of hell you've been catching, and let him know that if he's not ready to clean his house up, if he's not ready to clean his house up, he shouldn't have a house. It should catch on fire and burn down.
So what I find particularly powerful about that is all I can think is David Walker's appeal to the colored people of the world. I don't know if you remember from last fall when we looked at that. I mean, yeah. So that is Malcolm X. And again, very powerful, just to hear him talk. So he gets assassinated in 1965. This happens, I believe, right about the time of the Selma March, if I remember correctly. I might have my timeline. I might be confusing it with the Selma movie. I don't know. I can't, too much history information. Anyways, so the other group that I want to point out is going to be the Black Panthers. The Black Panthers are this group that are created in Oakland, California, specifically by Huey Newton, and they embody aspects of Black power, but they are a unique, particular kind of more militant organization. Again, they're Black Panthers for self-defense, and embrace Black nationalism and economic self-sufficiency. They take advantage of California gun laws to begin carrying around guns on their back and out in the open, and they begin a process of monitoring the police in Oakland, California. And so that's very confrontational against police brutality, definitely pointing out the challenges that African Americans in California are facing with racial attitudes, right? But it's not just about that. The Black Panthers have a series of lunch programs, breakfast programs, all that kind of stuff, make a huge difference in African American communities in California. And they talk about having self-sufficient Black communities and that kind of thing. So I want you to know that while certainly the Texas standards and a superficial analysis of the Black Panthers would see them as not being as being much more militant and being much more about self-defense and focus on the Black leather coats and the Black berets, they're actually much more than that. There's a lot there that talks about economic strength and economic empowerment and creating strong communities. So the next video is going to kind of talk a little bit about the Black Panther movement and kind of revisit like what they're about.
The stories in the news today remind me of the sentiments of almost 50 years ago, when many young Black people felt that policing for them was unfair.
During that time period, being Black in America meant that you didn't walk down the street with the same sense of safety and the same sense of privilege as a white person.
There was absolutely no difference in the way the police treated us in Mississippi than they did in California. They may not have called you nigger every day, but they treated you the same way they did in Mississippi.
The police jump on you, eat you up, put the gun at your head. This is what we were going through on a daily basis.
I'm tired of it. I'll stay here as long as I have to.
Now, as then, the need for change is real. Nearly every Black man I know has a story about an encounter with the police. I myself have been stopped, searched, and had a gun put to my head for no rational reason. One response to police brutality in 1966 was the founding of the Black Panther Party for self-defense.
We use the Black Panther as our symbol because of the nature of a panther. Panther doesn't strike anyone, but when he's assailed upon, that he'll back up first. But if the aggressor continues, then he'll strike out.
When I first met Huey and Bobby, they were in the process of forming an organization for primarily self-defense. We didn't plan to have a nationwide organization, anything like that. We were organized and dealing with the problems in Oakland.
In 1966, California law allowed civilians to carry loaded weapons as long as they were not concealed, as do many states today. And the newly formed Black Panther Party took advantage of the law.
The California Penal Code Section 12020 through 12027, and also the Second Amendment of the Constitution guarantees the citizen a right to bear arms on public property.
Huey said we're going to carry our guns and we're going to follow the police. And if they stop someone, we're going to stop. We're going to maintain a legal distance. and we're going to observe these so-called law officers in the performance of their duty.
You're coming around the corner to stay facing the way you are.
We would stop. We would get out of the cars. We would walk up to the scene. Those who had rifles would carry them in the open, clearly visible.
We would stand at a distance where the police couldn't say they were interfering with their arrest or their detention of the individual, and make sure that there was no brutality.
The police were confronted by citizens who were not just voicing their opinions, but were armed.
They would take the weapon and pass it across like this, and it would sweep right over the officer.
No one would do anything until a policeman ejected a round in the chamber. Then we would all eject rounds in the chamber. And all up and down the street, you could hear this clackety clack, 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 clack.
And then when the traffic stop or the incident's over, they bring the weapon down across by you like this and get back in their car and drive off. It was pretty intimidating.
The Black Panther Party spread quickly, partly because young African Americans across the country had similar experiences with the police.
We would get calls from Atlanta, Nashville, Raleigh, North Carolina, from Washington, D.C., Bridgeport, Connecticut. Every city, small or large you can think of, wanted a chapter of the Black Panther Party.
There's no question that the Panthers were provocative, but there's also no question that law enforcement exaggerated the threat they posed and overreacted.
Do you feel the nation is in trouble?
I think very definitely it is.
Well, what is the answer?
The answer is vigorous law enforcement.
That's the only answer.
That's the only answer.
How about justice? You hear a lot about justice with law enforcement.
Justice is merely incidental to law and order.
FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover today asserted that the Black Panthers represent the greatest internal threat to the nation. Hoover said the Panthers have perpetrated numerous assaults on police and have engaged in violent confrontations throughout the country.
When Hoover identified the Black Panther Party as the number one threat to the national security of the United States at a time when they're fighting in Vietnam, of course that was crazy, but it was politically very effective. And it says to law enforcement at the local level, we can take the gloves off now. We don't have to respect the civil liberties, and we can go after them with everything we got.
Police say there was sniper fire throughout the early morning hours, so they moved in cautiously.
Police and Black Panthers clash in Houston, New Orleans, and other cities.
The Black Panther police
In the
shootout
pre-dawn hours in Chicago today, police and Negroes fought a pitched battle.
Obviously, we are nowhere near this today. In fact, we may be at a transformative moment. People of all ages and races are recognizing the problems with policing in Black communities and are protesting. Now, there's a chance for real change. But police departments and political leaders must not overreact as they did 50 years ago. They need to listen.
When I say no, you say violence. No. Violence. No. Violence. When I say no, you say violence. No. Violence. No. Violence. Justice. No peace.
So that, again, does a really good job of kind of telling you about Black Panthers and really contextualizing it within not only our current environment, but what they were reacting against. And I'll leave it up to you to decide how you feel about their tactics. The next thing that I want to mention is the assassination of Martin Luther King. So, of course, by the late 60s, we have the civil rights movement fragmented, with different groups attacking different things, and really, economic issues being at the forefront. And it's hard to change economic circumstances. We've seen that with the Great Depression, right? It's really hard to do something about that. And so this has competed to these different visions, or fractured to these different visions about what to do. And again, then you have white supporters that aren't sure what to make of Black power, feel rejected, right? And of course, now in 2019, we have this framework of privilege and I think that we can, and wokeness, that I think kind of helps us maybe put this into a different understanding than, say, 20 years ago. That the issue is, white people don't have to, they don't always understand, and they don't have to understand. Like, they can recognize there's a different perspective. So I think it's kind of interesting to put it into that context. So by 1968, Martin Luther King had been spending lots of time. He'd started this Poor People's Campaign, really advocated, was actually trying to do another march that included Indigenous people and Latinos and women and all this kind of stuff. So he's trying to broaden this base of support that talks about the economic oppression that takes place within society. And so he's trying to deal with that. So he's going to, plan this whole campaign. And he goes into Memphis, Tennessee, because there's Black sanitation workers who are on strike, asking for better wages, better conditions. And so he goes there to give them some support. And when he does that, you're going to see that he goes to Memphis and he gets shot. So the last video that I'm going to show you has to do with his assassination, and kind of gives us some context for that.
Does it feel like it's been 50 years?
Feels like it was yesterday.
It was April 4th, 1968, in Memphis, Tennessee. Before Andrew Young was an ambassador to the world. Before Jesse Jackson became a reverend and a groundbreaking political figure. They were two young men dedicated to the cause of equality, led by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and it was a chilly Thursday afternoon at the Lorraine Motel.
I was talking to him, telling him he needed a coat. And he sort of raised his head to kind of test the weather. And pow.
A single shot to his chin, and King was dead. He was 39 years old. Now, a half-century later, Young and Jackson returned to the very spot where their friend and leader was assassinated.
His shoes got caught under here, and it knocked him out of his shoes.
A photographer who was staying 3 rooms down snapped this iconic image as King lay dying.
And we were pointing over there because the police were here. They were running over this way, and we were trying to tell them to go back that way. That's where the shot came from.
Do you think he heard the shot?
I don't think he heard the shot or felt it. I think it was a beautiful death. My first reaction was to be mad, and the second reaction was to say, well, if anybody is entitled to a reward, you have sure earned it. And, take your flight to heaven.
Young went on to serve as congressman, as U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, and as mayor of Atlanta. Jackson continued social and political activism and ran for president twice.
Every move I made, whether it was a demonstration or running for the presidency, I always felt his spirit, and some way I touched base with him for doing it.
Jackson, now 76, and Young, 86, say King did not fear death. And even as they stand on the balcony that was once stained with King's blood, they're convinced that he will never die.
I've been to 152 countries. I've never been anywhere where people have wanted to ask me about Martin Luther King.
If he'd be 89 years old, he'd be just an old preacher who preached great sermons. His martyrdom is power. His spirit is alive.
Victor Blackwell, CNN, Memphis.
So that kind of tells you about his assassination. And again, so this is typically 1968 is seen as kind of the quote unquote end of the civil rights movement. Although we might, argue and have a more nuanced conversation about when it really ended, largely because the legacy of civil rights continues, right? After Martin Luther King's assassination, Congress will pass another Civil Rights Act in 1968 that prohibits discrimination in housing. Remember, one of the challenges after the Voting Rights Bill is passed is that African Americans are still having trouble finding housing in good neighborhoods. And so what you have happening is that they, that this Fair Housing Act prohibits discrimination in people finding a place to live. And the movement continues to fracture into a bunch of different groups. And in fact, some of the things that you'll see in the Ed Puzzle videos will be videos about women and the National Organization for Women. This is a movement started under Betty Friedan. The American Indian Movement, the AIM movement, the Latino movement, whether that's LULAC, the League of United Latin American Citizens, or La Raza Unida, worker rights, particularly migrant farmers like the United Farm Workers Union, led by Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta. And then, of course, eventually in the 70s, LGBTQ rights begin to come out. And, you have lots of different movements happening, but you'll also have a related conservative movement that pushes back against all this civil rights, all this change. Really almost a different type of reassertion of white power, much like we saw with the Jim Crow era and that sort of thing. So I'm going to stop here because this has gone on long enough. And I'll record another section about LBJ, and we'll talk about, and then another one about other protest groups.